All right, we're live. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me for the next installment of my Wellness Wednesday series, which took a little summer hiatus and is now back for fall. Today, we're going to be talking about an issue that I feel like I should have addressed on my site, when I first started it and started talking about healthy eating, and that's kind of the emotional side of the equation. So I know I personally don't have a perfect relationship with food just yet. I don't think really there's any woman who can claim to have a completely uncomplicated relationship with food. So I have a great guest here with me today, Isabel Foxen Duke, who is the founder of Stop Fighting Food. And we're going to kind of talk about some of these issues around the diet binge cycle, what types of even when you're really healthy, maybe that doesn't mean you're emotionally healthy, and just general strategies to stop being crazy around food.
Yeah.
Hello,
Yes,
welcome.
absolutely. Hi, thank you for having me. This is so exciting.
Absolutely. So why don't we start off by you telling us a little bit about yourself, since not everyone watching may know all the fabulous work you've done.
Yeah, so basically what I do, like you said, is I help women stop feeling a little crazy around food. Like food can be a little bit emotionally taxing. Making choices around food. What's the right choice to make? Am I doing this correctly? Obviously body image, as I mentioned off air, is a huge component of this, right? Like, how do I know, like, where am I making choices for my health versus where am I making choices for my, because I want to control my body, and what are the repercussions of that? How does that affect, everything I think about food? And, ultimately it can be a real like tailspin in women's minds. Like food can take up a lot of our mental energy. It's not easy for most people, which is unfortunate because you'd think like food is supposed to be this like natural, biological, instinctive thing, and because we live in kind of like a diet culture and like a food obsessed culture, it kind of can become a war for some women, right? Like it can become this like struggle, like what am I supposed to eat? What shouldn't I eat? Oh shit, I ate that thing. Now I feel badly about myself. That's sort of the biggest one, is like feeling guilt around food and shame around food and guilt and shame around our bodies. So this is really the broader area that I talk about, is like helping women sort of just develop more sanity and ease in their relationship with food, which ultimately has a lot of impacts on how women end up eating, because when women are obsessed with food, they often find themselves getting trapped in the diet binge cycle, right? Like I'm really good one day and then I fell off the wagon and I'm being really bad, and I can't stop eating chocolate chip cookies. So that's my area.
Amazing. So these issues are so common. I feel like sometimes we just chalk them up to some sort of normalcy. Do most of the women you work with know that they're crazy about food?
Yeah, I mean, the women who come to me generally find my website and they think to themselves immediately, oh my gosh, I didn't know that other people felt this way. Like, I didn't know that other people were like in the kitchen eating, crackers, like standing up straight out of the cabinets, hoping their husband didn't catch them. Like there's a lot of this sort of like secretive, like hiding behavior, lots of shame, lots of guilt around food, particularly when we're not eating perfectly, which no one ever does or ever will. And what's interesting is like the shame and guilt sort of perpetuates and can create all of these even further negative and self-destructive behaviors. It's like, oh my gosh, I feel so guilty that I broke my diet or broke the way of eating that I'm supposed to eat. I ate this cookie. Now, like, screw it. I call it like fuck it eating. I'm going to eat the whole thing and then tomorrow I'll be good again. And it's this cycle that women find themselves in. And most women feel really alone in that cycle. Like they don't realize that this is something that huge numbers of women, to some degree or another, the vast majority of women, I would make the argument, are dealing with to some extent, because there's so much pressure on women around food in our society. So, of course, it's going to kind of lead to this sort of like rebellious guilt, shame, I'm being good, I'm being bad, I fell off the wagon, I suck, oh my God, I had one brownie, I might as well have the whole tin of brownies and start again tomorrow. That whole cycle is far more common than people think. So when people find me, they're usually like, oh my God, like I cannot believe somebody is saying this out loud. Like people find a real comfort in it. So yeah, so generally, I guess the answer to your question is like most women do have this, most women who work with me kind of have this sense of like, oh my God, she's like reading my mind. Like, how did she know? But what they don't realize is
everyone talks about eating disorders and no one talks about this gray area in between, which is, you know, that a lot of things could be happening up here that aren't really, well, but regardless of the shame and the hidden behaviors. But some of the things might not be manifesting in a behavior that would fall into the category of like a textbook eating disorder, but is still obviously disordered eating.
Oh, 100%. I mean, that's one of my greatest criticisms of, you know, how sort of eating disorders are discussed in our culture. It's like, it's not like you either have one or you don't. For the vast majority of people, like, it's a spectrum, right? And we usually define clinical eating disorders as, you know, when you get to the point where you're engaging in really physically self-harming behaviors, right? When you get to the point of like throwing up your food, when you get to the point of being so clinically underweight that like it's dangerous for your health, like when you get to the point of you know, X, Y, or Z physical self-harming behavior, that's when people start to define you as eating disordered. But in reality, there's a lot of shit that happens before that, you know, like there's a lot of just like crazy frustration and just like difficulty with food that like, so the vast majority of women are dealing with to some extent, right? Like just this feeling of like, I shouldn't have done that. Should I do this? You know, what should I try with food next? Like, what should I, you know, what's the latest diet? Like this obsessing, right? Like this craziness, this feeling of like my mind is consumed with thoughts of food and dieting and eating and not eating and, you know, all that stuff way before you'd ever get to the point of being diagnosed with an eating disorder, you know?
Totally.
So,
actually, that's one of my questions I have for you is about the talk, because I catch myself using like guilt-oriented words about food sometimes myself. And I remember when I first, you know, was diagnosed with a gluten allergy and had like was told by my doctor I have to stop if I'm going to be able to manage my autoimmune disease. Yeah. I remember like in the beginning I didn't take it that seriously, and I would sometimes like eat gluten. And when I would do it, I would say to my boyfriend, like, I'm going to cheat tonight. And he was like, don't call it cheating. Like, what are you cheating? I mean, you can't digest it. So
right.
Some sort of diet here. Like, you're cheating yourself, if anything.
Right.
But I still catch myself using that kind of terminology around my allergy, which is interesting because it's just kind of ingrained.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that, because one of the biggest questions I get from women when we talk about, you know, basically giving up diets is, well, what if I have medical reason to not eat a certain food? You know, like, how do I manage that? And in my mind, I'm like, they're very different things. Like, when you're giving up a specific food for a medical reason, theoretically, you know, if you do choose to break that rule in quotes or cheat in quotes, it's not like you're just choosing to do that to yourself. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're just making that choice, and it's just the choice you made. Like, okay, today it's worth it for me to have the cupcake, and I know I'm going to be incurring physical repercussions of that, but c'est la vie. It doesn't affect my self-esteem, right? Like, I also actually don't eat gluten because of intestinal difficulties with gluten. And like, I always try to explain to people, like, if I were to eat gluten, it wouldn't make me feel like a bad person, you know? Like, I wouldn't feel like I've done something hugely wrong or like I'm so bad. I wouldn't take it on to be like, oh my God, I suck that I ate gluten. It would just be like, okay, now you have to go sit on the toilet, you know, like, it's just like, you know, like, it's just a simple, basic physical consequence to eating a certain way. It's not something that affects my self-esteem or like feeling of self-worth as a person, which is where a lot of women get really tripped up, is that women who are accustomed to traditional diet culture, which is what our society is largely teaching women, you know, they get caught up in like, basically giving certain foods morality, right? Like, it's righteous to eat one way or another, which is it's that righteousness, it's that morality around food that ultimately ends up creating this diet binge cycle, right? Like this, like, I screwed up today, I suck, like, I might as well go like stuff my face in like a box of whatever because, you know, I've blown it and whatever, you know? So, yeah, so ultimately, like, making decisions for like medical reasons or for true health purposes should be thought about in a very different way than diet mentality and diet culture.
Yeah.
That has to, but it's complex, and it's not easy for people to make the switch because we're so bombarded with diet mentality all the time. So it's like hard to make that mental shift.
Are there any like terms or phrases that you try and ban with your clients, like cheating and things like that?
Yeah, even something like should or shouldn't, you know, like even something as basic and fundamental as that. Like, I'll always say, like, I can eat gluten, but the result of me eating gluten is that I will get sick. You know, like, that's it. Like, there's no morality around it, right? Like, there's no, like, I'm a bad person if I eat gluten. It's no, like, oh my God, like, this is like the devil and like I can't do this. It's just, if I eat gluten, the consequences of me eating gluten are this. And like, knowing that information, like, which do I choose? You know, like, it's just a choice. Like, ultimately, I could choose to eat the gluten, and that would be fine. I would just have to suffer the consequences of that, you know? As opposed, yeah.
Like, now that there's just been this huge, like, avalanche of wellness information, and, like, obviously diet trends have existed since the dawn of time, but for some reason I feel like now it's just, like, an even more saturated market. Like, how does that affect, like, this issue of morality? Do people just feel guilty all the time no matter what they eat? Have you noticed any changes?
I mean, health is the new religion. You know what I mean? Like, as we're moving away, I mean, depending on what part of the country and what part of the world you're in, right? Like, you could make arguments either way, but like, there's certainly a great, you know, population of people in the United States who are moving away from religion, and health has become this new way of like asserting like who we are and our identity, and like, this is right and that is wrong. And, you know, it's such an intensely personal thing, yet like, we definitely, I think a lot of people really feel the need to like shout their you know, like, give people shoulds and shouldn'ts. Health can be very evangelical, you know, so like, so, you know, health is really, it's rapidly growing as an obsession in our country that's beyond just, I have a value of taking care of my body. It's beyond that now, right? Like, it's turned into, this is what's right and wrong. This is what other people should be doing. You know, like, if you're paleo versus vegan, it's like this like big like identity issue. And like, you know, if you're paleo or if you're vegan, you like strongly dislike the people on the other side, you know, and it's just this like weird thing. So, yeah, the health thing in this country is getting blown up out of proportion. I also think, and this is my personal opinion, you know, a lot of the obsession with health has revolved around the diet industry, the weight loss industry specifically, right? Like, I don't think if women weren't so obsessed with weight loss, I don't think the health industry, the for-profit health industry, would be nearly as profitable or prevalent as it is. You know, a lot of people who are in the health world sort of get into the health world through this like weight loss lens. And like, even if you look at like people like Mark Hyman and, you know, all these people who are like really smart, interesting doctors who they really just want to like help people like live a long, healthful, prosperous life, you'll see like the way they sell their products is all weight loss based because they know that's what sells. You know, like, people want to buy weight loss even more than they want to buy health. So there's this like intermingling between health and weight loss that is a little bit, I would say, a little bit damaging to our culture and the conversation that's going on. And that's been aggressively, exponentially growing since, you know, the 70s and 80s, but even before that. But definitely in the past 20 years, it's like the obsession with weight is getting more and more out of control.
Oh my gosh. So back to the emotional eating side of things. I want to hear like exactly what you mean by that, because I watched your free training videos, which are amazing, and you guys out there want some more information on all of these issues, you should definitely go check them out. They're 3 and they're just great. So one distinction that you make in one is that emotional eating is not always a bad thing. So I actually got, when I posted about this Wellness Wednesday, I got a comment on my Instagram photo that said, well, I just had a very emotional experience like housing a chocolate donut, and it felt great. And I was like, well, good for you. That's like very positive emotions. So
totally. I mean, it's kind of like this conversation that we just had about gluten, you know, like emotional eating. If we look at it from a value-neutral, non-moralizing standpoint, emotional eating is just like eating over feelings. It gives you temporary relief. It doesn't solve any emotional problems, right? So like using it over and over and over again and not solving your problems is probably not the best way to go. However, like it does give you like an immediate relief. It's like an immediate coping mechanism. It distracts you from what's going on. That's just what it is. It's just a coping mechanism, right? Like a coping mechanism could really span the gamut, and I've said this before in other interviews, like taking a warm bath is a coping mechanism, and snorting heroin is a coping mechanism too. You know, like emotional eating falls somewhere in the middle, you know, like it's, you know, coping mechanisms all have just different consequences and different benefits, you know, and the consequence of emotional eating are, you know, kind of differ depending on, you know, what you're eating, obviously, and how often you're eating emotionally. But really, that's all it is. It's like you just know that when you choose to eat something emotionally, like you get to make the decision right then and there, like, is this worth it or not? You know, like I would make the argument that, you know, having an occasional cupcake when I like feel like I want a little pick-me-up is really not the end of the world. In fact, that might be like a really like reasonable way for me to just like get a little like excitement that day. Like I'm gonna go have like a really beautiful French macaroon, and I'm not hungry. My body doesn't certainly need that sugar, but like it's worth it. Like it's like having a cocktail or something. Like I'm gonna just enjoy it because that's my choice today. So it's certainly not always a bad thing. You know, it's just like I want women to feel empowered in their choices and feel like they can decide when it's appropriate to have a cupcake and when it's appropriate to have a cookie, and just feel like good about their choices, feel like they're making informed, aware decisions without this burden of, oh my God, I shouldn't be, which ultimately just feeds our obsession with food and feeds our wanting to eat more and more of it, ironically.
So how do you, like, what are your recommendations for someone becoming more aware of like where their food motivations come from, like the emotional side, the physical side? I feel like when you get too much in your head, you just get completely detached from that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely a balance, because I've worked with women who become obsessive about like, oh my gosh, was I hungry? Did I need this? Was this emotional? You know, and that can be like its own, you know, kind of hell in and of itself. So I definitely try to encourage women for the most part to just like chill out, man, like relax, like it is just food, like let's get real here, like come on now. On the other hand, like if you wanted to like really in a very non-judgmental, non-shaming way, which is really the key thing here, is like, can you look at your emotional eating from a non-judgmental, non-shaming lens? Then you can just, you know, kind of cultivate awareness and make choices with awareness. Like, oh, like, I noticed that I'm wanting, like, a cupcake right now. I wonder why that is. Oh, okay, maybe it's because, like, I'm really bored at work and I don't really like my job. And, like, then I can make a decision. Well, is it worth it for me to eat the cupcake to, like, take the edge off of me being bored at work, or is it not? And, like, I can just make that decision with awareness rather than, oh, my God, I suck. I shouldn't have done this, blah, 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 which ultimately is what leads to binge eating, which I also distinguish from emotional eating, right? Like, binge eating is sort of what happens when we get caught up in that obsessive, shaming, you know, mentality of, like, one-track mind, food, 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 versus emotional eating, which could just be pretty benign, you know? Like, having a cupcake when you're bored at work is not the end of the world. Yeah.
I like that. So back to the diet thing briefly, just to like touch on a couple of the trends, one of them being juicing. I'm so curious to get your thoughts on juicing in general, and you know what it does for women, both emotionally and physically, and I guess what it represents, which is essentially just not eating for 3 days.
Yeah, well, so like in general, I'm not a big fan of like forced calorie, deprivation. Like I think that almost always backfires for most women, right? Like there are a few handful of women who can like somehow like muster up being able to like deprive themselves without having some sort of like rebellious reaction or without becoming obsessed with food. But the vast majority of people incur negative psychological and physical consequences from extreme calorie deprivation. That being said, ultimately, there's so much I could say on this topic, but I'll just say really quickly, like juicing, like I drink juices with meals, like I drink a green juice with my egg sandwich, like that's how I roll. Like juices are great. They're like condensed nutrients, you're fitting like 8 vegetables in like a tiny glass that your stomach can hold really easily. Like that's awesome. Like I love juicing. Like I am like a juice press club member, but I don't fast, like I drink juice because like I want the nutrients and I want the, all of the benefits that those juices give me. I don't need to only drink juice in order to get the benefits of juice. So I'll just say that right up front. As far as emotionally, like I always say, like women are far more addicted to dieting than they are to eating, right? Like when people say like I'm like addicted to food, like generally speaking, people are what they're actually addicted to is dieting. And then of course, when we diet, we get triggered into this rebellious emotional eating, binge eating cycle. So it feels like we're addicted to food, but really what we're addicted to is restricting. And a cleanse is like the ultimate of seductive, sexy restriction. It's like, oh my God. Yeah, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm just going to go on a cleanse. I'm just going to like do this thing for 3 days and then like everything that's wrong in my life will be better. Like in 3 days, like everything will be fine. Like my boyfriend will propose to me. I'll get a promotion. 3 days of juice cleansing fixes everything. There ain't nothing 3 days of juice cleansing can't fix. Like that's sort of the mentality that women fall into. With diets in general, but juice cleansing is particularly seductive because it's this like really fast, intense thing that we think is going to like change our life in 72 hours.
And I feel like it's an excuse for women not to eat because it's become like so commonplace to go on a juice cleanse. You're like, I can't, I'm on juice cleanse. It's like a nice little scapegoat.
100%. Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, that's really like what it is. Then that goes into the whole conversation with this sort of like co-mingling of health and weight loss, where like being like, oh, I'm not like obsessed with being like, trying to control my body for the purpose of like getting more people to like me. I just want to be healthy. Like, like it's a rationalization. It's for many women, it's bullshit. So, and a juice cleanse is like a perfect example of that. It's like a socially acceptable way to starve yourself.
Totally. Unfortunately. Is there a word? I feel like maybe I read it somewhere. You told me at some point in the past. Like, is there a word for this type of like health obsession as an eating disorder?
Yes, it's called orthorexia. Which is a clinical eating disorder term. I don't know how it's defined. I mean, I'm sure I am not a clinical therapist. So like, first of all, I'm just going to say that right now. I am not treating eating disorders. I am by no means a clinical therapist in eating disorders. I have my, my private opinion, or not so private, my opinions, but this is all to be taken just as like information in my opinion. I'm just going to say that. So on that note, I don't know how clinical therapists are diagnosing orthorexia. I'm sure, when people go into a clinical therapist office, they're incentivized to give people diagnoses of some kind for health insurance reasons. So like if you come in and like, something that you're struggling with is like thinking about, making healthful foods or primarily feeling guilt and shame when you don't make healthful choices, right? So like when I eat the cookie or the whatever I deem to be unhealthy, I feel awful about myself and it affects my self-esteem. That's, I'm assuming, how that would be diagnosed. I mean, that happens to people all the time who aren't being diagnosed as orthorexia, right? Like it goes back to our to our original conversation, which is like a lot of women feel guilty when they make quote unquote unhealthy choices that would never be diagnosed as eating disordered. You know, like this is commonplace. Like we have like one big, if that's how we're defining eating disorders, then we have like one giant, huge, like mass cultural eating disorder on our hands, you know, like, so, you know, different women are going to feel different levels of like needing it to pursue help and get help in this, and clinical therapy is definitely a huge piece of that. But yeah, I mean, for sure, I would say the vast majority of women who feel guilty when they eat something quote unquote unhealthy are not being diagnosed as having eating disorders.
So if it all kind of like stems back to, well, one part of the equation is obviously control, which we talked about. And if the second part is really stemming from weight, like how does body issue fit into all of this, self-esteem, like what does your work do to come through those things?
Right. I mean, and that's ultimately kind of the bottom. That body image is what distinguishes women who are making healthful choices because they want to treat their bodies well, and women who are making healthful choices, in quotes, because they can't stand themselves the way they are, you know, and it's like coming from a place of self-hate versus a place of self-love. Interestingly enough, what I've found, and what is kind of part of what I teach, is that when we make decisions around food from a place of self-love, when we're making decisions around food from a place of like, I love my body, I want to treat her well, I want to do what's right by her, I want to, you know, make the choice that's going to make her feel good, that's a very different motivation than I need to eat this healthy choice because I suck and I have fat thighs and my body's not good enough and I better do this, otherwise like all hell's gonna break loose. They're just very different like attitudes towards health. I would say that the primary, right, the self-love motivation, not only is that more mentally healthy, but it also tends to produce healthier behaviors, right? Like people who are making healthful choices from a place of self-love tend to be able to make those choices more sustainably. They tend to not get into on and off the wagon mentality, meaning like, oh, I had a cookie, I might as well eat the whole box. Like that's a self-hating motivation that causes that. Somebody who's coming from a place of self-love will just be like, oh, I ate a cookie, but like I've had enough. Like she's good now, you know. So it's they're just different. They're different motivations, and they have both of these motivations have different consequences on how we actually behave with food. So a lot of women who are frustrated, like, I know I should be eating this way, but I can't. Chances are their motivations are out of line, right? Like their incentives for eating a certain way are coming from a place of I'm not good enough rather than from a place of I love myself and want to treat myself well.
So how do you bridge the gap?
Body image work, man. Like body image work is so critical at every size on the weight spectrum. Like there is no too thin to do body image work. There is no too fat to do body image work. Everyone everywhere on the weight spectrum needs to come to a place where they respect themselves enough, right, to make choices out of self-love rather than feeling like, oh my God, no, but really I'm fat and I suck and I'm a horrible person and blah, 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 blah. It's like, it doesn't even matter. Like, it does not matter how big or thin you are to be doing this work where you're like, you know what, like this is my body. This is what it looks like today. I don't know what it's going to look like tomorrow. I don't know what it's going to look like next year. I don't know what it's going to look like in 10 years. But today, this is where I'm at, and I'm going to respect myself in the body that I have right now, right? Like that's where we need to get women. And women are not in that place, right? Like vast majority of women are like, well, my body sucks right now, but I'm just going to go on this cleanse and everything's going to be great in the future, which backfires because when we're making choices from this place of not being good enough right now, we fall into this rebellious binge eating, diet binge cycle. So we never end up getting to the place that we think we're going to get, right? Like so many women are never actually ultimately achieving this place of good enough. And, you know, it's just the cycle. So really the key to changing the mental behaviors and attitudes that will ultimately lead to making the most healthful choices for an individual come from doing work, body image work, right? Like come from doing work where you're like, okay, this is where my body is today. Like this is what my body looks like. Like I'm committed to treating her well and loving her no matter what. I'm not going to hide her. I'm not going to shame her. Like I'm like cultivating self-respect here, regardless of where you're at today as far as size is concerned.
Is there like one tactic that people could take away? I know the gratitude practice is like really in the wellness zeitgeist now, and I know a lot of people who have begun their own gratitude practices, and that's really helped them. But is there something like that in regard to body image that someone could do every day in order to take that next step forward?
Yeah, there's a few things. I mean, I love the gratitude. Like I love even just the idea of thinking about your body like a human being, which she is, you know, like thinking about your body like an animal, you know, like would you treat a child or even like a pet the way you treat your body? You know, like that's really powerful. Like really getting in touch with the fact that like your body is a human animal. Like that's what this is. Like we are mammals, like walking the earth. Like, and can we start to really look at our bodies like, oh my gosh, like this is a living, breathing thing, no different from a child or an animal or whatever. You know, can we start treating ourselves that way? You know, I think that that's a big mental shift for people to make, is not looking at your body as something that you're supposed to like control and contort and force and enslave to do what your mind would have it do, but actually look at your body as like a living, breathing organism that needs to be cared for and taken care of, you know? So that's one. You know, on that sort of similar note, you know, like you said, like I think the gratitude practices in general, like thinking about like kind of what your body's been through and what it's done for you, you know, is huge. Like really getting into that sort of mindset of like, wow, like my little heart keeps beating regardless of the fact that I tortured it so much in college with all these crazy binge eating, diet, starvation. I mean, I've put my body through such hell, and it just keeps fighting to keep me alive. You know, it's my body's got my back. I should get its back, you know? And then also this is like a big, you know, one of the only sort of clinical evidenced ways of changing people's body image is to actually start surrounding themselves with images of people who look like them. Or, yeah, so like, you know, my Instagram feed is like filled up with like natural models and like people. There's all sorts of people on the internet who are promoting positive body image. Like the more you can kind of go on a little bit of a media diet, if you will, and sort of really like start to bring images of people of varying different shapes and sizes. Like if you start to bring body diversity into your world, right? If you start inviting body diversity into just your visual world, that actually has been proven to change the way women think about their own bodies. The media is very powerful and is definitely a really big part of this problem. So there's all this sort of alternative media coming out with, you know, women of all various different shapes and sizes wearing cool clothes and, you know, having awesome makeup and stuff, and exposing yourself to those kinds of images is very powerful.
I love that. Okay, well, you've been amazing. We're going to wrap this up, but I have to ask you a question that I ask every single Wellness Wednesday expert. And you may have given your answer already, which is fine. You can elaborate if you want. But just back to, you know, all of the confusing information that's out there, if you could tell someone one thing and one thing only to change about their lifestyle that would have just a real general benefit to their well-being, what would it be?
I would say just be kind to your body. You know, like just be kind to yourself, not even just your body, just be kind to yourself. Like the more self-compassion I practice, like the better my life becomes. And I find that in my clients and just all over the world. I feel like the biggest epidemic like we are suffering from in this country and throughout the world is just the epidemic of self-criticism and self-judgment. And, you know, if we can just really understand that at any given moment in our life, we are doing the best job that we possibly can, given the tools and information that we have, like really feel compassion for ourselves and for our choices and for our bodies, for our minds, you know, like that's it, you know, like that's what's up.
I love that. Well, thank you, Isabel, for joining me and for sharing all your wisdom. Definitely go check out Isabel's training series, Stop Fighting Food. Really quick, informative videos, especially if you've been struggling with some of these issues, as I'm sure many of you have. All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.